the night was calm. The ocean looked like black glass stretching endlessly under a sky filled with silent stars. On the deck of the RMS Titanic, passengers laughed, walked, and admired the cold beauty of the North Atlantic. For many of them, this was the journey of a lifetime aboard the most magnificent ship ever built. But deep beneath the quiet surface of the water, a silent thread drifted in the darkness. Then, at 11:40 p.m., a sudden shudder ran through the ship. It was subtle. Almost gentle. Some passengers barely noticed. But within minutes, whispers began to spread through the corridors and grand staircases of the Titanic. Something was wrong. Far below the decks, freezing seawater had begun to pour into the hull. And in that terrifying moment, the people on board began to realize a truth that would soon echo across the world: the unsinkable ship was sinking. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was obsessed with progress. Technology was advancing rapidly, and the great nations of Europe competed to build bigger, faster, and more luxurious ocean liners. In this race for prestige, the White Star Line envisioned something extraordinary: a ship that would redefine travel across the Atlantic. Built in the shipyards of Belfast by Harland and Wolff, the Titanic was designed to be the largest and most advanced passenger ship ever constructed. Stretching more than 269 meters long and towering like a floating city, it was a masterpiece of engineering and ambition. The ship contains 16 watertight compartments, massive engines, electric elevators, luxurious lounges, and a grand staircase that looked more like the interior of a palace than a vessel at sea. Newspapers called it a marvel of modern civilization. Many believed it was practically unsinkable. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a symbol of human confidence at the dawn of a new century. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic began its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, bound for New York City. As crowds gathered along the docks, thousands watched in awe as the enormous vessel slowly pulled away from shore. On board were more than 2,200 passengers and crew members representing every layer of society. In first class, the wealthiest people in the world enjoyed unmatched luxury. Millionaires and aristocrats dined beneath sparkling chandeliers, relaxed in smoking rooms, and strolled along elegant promenades overlooking the sea. Their cabins were decorated like fine hotel suites, complete with carved wood panels and plush furniture. Meanwhile, far below in third class, immigrants from across Europe traveled toward the promise of a new life in America. Their accommodations were simpler, but the atmosphere was filled with hope. Families shared meals, sang songs, and dreamed about the future waiting for them across the ocean. For everyone on board, the Titanic represented opportunity, adventure, and the optimism of a modern world. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, the voyage seemed peaceful and uneventful. The ocean was unusually calm, and the weather remained clear. But hidden within the wireless messages received by the Titanic's radio operators were warnings that should have caused concern. Several nearby ships had reported dangerous ice fields drifting across the shipping lanes. Large icebergs had been spotted throughout the region. These warnings were noted but not treated with urgency. The Titanic continued to travel at high speed through the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Captain Edward Smith, one of the most experienced captains in the White Star Line, believed the powerful ship could safely navigate the area. After all, the Titanic was considered the most advanced liner ever built. Few people imagined that anything could threaten it. As night fell on April 14th, the temperature dropped sharply. The sea remained eerily smooth, making it difficult to detect icebergs in the darkness. High above the decks, two lookouts stood in the crow's nest scanning the horizon. The air was bitterly cold, and the ocean stretched into darkness in every direction. Then suddenly, just before midnight, one of the lookouts saw something impossible to ignore: a massive iceberg rising directly ahead. The warning bell rang 3 times. A phone call was sent immediately to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. The officers reacted instantly, ordering the ship to turn in engines to reverse. But the Titanic was simply too large, moving too fast through the water. Seconds later, the enormous vessel brushed along the side of the iceberg. The collision did not sound like a crash. Instead, it was a long grinding scrape of steel against ice. For many passengers, it felt like little more than a strange vibration beneath their feet. But deep below the surface, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had ripped open several sections of the hull, allowing freezing seawater to rush into the ship. Within minutes, the lower compartments began to fill. Engineers and shipbuilders quickly realized the terrifying truth: the Titanic had been designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments. But now 5 were already filling with water. The ship's fate was sealed. Slowly but inevitably, the bow of the Titanic began to sink lower into the Atlantic. At first, many passengers remained calm. Some were told there had been only a minor accident. Crew members moved quietly through the corridors preparing lifeboats as a precaution. But the Titanic carried lifeboats for only about half the people on board, a decision based on outdated safety regulations that assumed such a ship would never sink. As the front of the ship dipped further into the water, the situation became impossible to hide. Cold ocean water crept across the lower decks. Panic began to spread. Families were awakened from their cabins. Passengers rushed into the freezing night wearing coats, blankets, and life jackets. The crew began loading lifeboats, prioritizing women and children first. Some passengers refused to leave the ship, convinced it was safer than the small wooden boats being lowered into the dark ocean. In the middle of the chaos, something remarkable happened. The ship's orchestra gathered on deck and began playing music. As fear spread across the Titanic, the musicians continued performing in an attempt to calm the passengers. Their melodies floated through the freezing night air as lifeboats were lowered one by one into the black water below. Meanwhile, distress signals were sent repeatedly through the wireless radio system, calling for help from nearby ships. But the nearest vessel capable of reaching them quickly was still hours away. As time passed, the angle of the ship became steeper. Water flooded the forward sections, and the stern rose higher into the air. People clung to railings as the deck tilted beneath their feet. The once magnificent ocean liner had become a towering structure slowly sliding into the sea. At around 2:20 a.m., the Titanic reached its final moments. Under immense stress, the massive ship broke apart. The front half disappeared beneath the water first, dragging hundreds of people into the freezing Atlantic. Moments later, the stern stood nearly vertical before plunging beneath the surface as well. The ocean quickly became filled with debris and desperate voices calling for help. But the water temperature was just below freezing. Within minutes, hypothermia began to claim lives. Those who had escaped in lifeboats could only watch in horror as the sounds of the disaster echoed across the dark ocean before slowly fading into silence. Nearly 2 hours later, lights appeared on the horizon. The RMS Carpathia had raced through the night after receiving the Titanic's distress signals. As dawn approached, the Carpathia arrived at the scene and began rescuing survivors from the lifeboats scattered across the icy sea. For those who survived, the sight of the rescue ship was both a relief and a heartbreak. More than 1,500 people had been lost in the disaster. When the survivors finally arrived in New York, the world was stunned. The Titanic had been the pride of modern engineering, a symbol of human achievement and confidence. Yet in a single night, it had vanished beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Newspapers across the globe reported the tragedy, and investigations soon revealed the mistakes and overconfidence that had contributed to the disaster. In the years that followed, the sinking of the Titanic changed maritime safety forever. New international laws required ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic to monitor dangerous icebergs. Radio communication became mandatory on passenger ships so that distress signals could never again go unheard. More than a century later, the story of the Titanic continues to capture the imagination of the world. Beneath nearly 4 kilometers of dark ocean water, the remains of the great ship still rest on the seafloor, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. But the memory of that night remains powerful. It is a story about ambition, tragedy, courage, and the fragile line between human confidence and the unstoppable forces of nature. On the night of April 14, 1912, the world believed it had built a ship that could not sink. By the early hours of April 15, the Atlantic Ocean had proven otherwise. And in doing so, it created one of the most unforgettable stories in human history.